Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us again for the first ever Parks Without Borders Summit. We had a full and very enlightening morning, and I promise you the afternoon will be more engaging. We heard things which I hadn't heard before, like Cap Happy and Edge and other creative things, but as we're gathered here in this room today to discuss the future of urban parks and of public spaces by exploring how data and technology can drive the urban design experience. And I'd be remiss not to share with you some news from Parks. Today, we are launching a new pilot program that will assist our agency in better understanding how public spaces are used and improve how parks are designed, programmed, and maintained. Through the pilot, Parks is installing a total of 5 solar-powered benches in Highbridge Parks on both the Manhattan and the Bronx side. These new high-tech benches provide free solar-powered charging for mobile devices and also tell us how many people visit Highbridge Park by counting the Wi-Fi enabled devices as they pass. The first of the 5 benches is being installed right now in the Bronx, and the other 4 benches will be installed in Manhattan in the coming weeks. Making this announcement in advance of this Smart Space panel launches a discussion about the future of our parks and how we can advance the uses of our public spaces with technology. And who better? And it's called SUFA, as you can see. And right now I'm excited. We're trying to periscope it live. We weren't able to get that feed. But it'll give you a chance to go up to the Highbridge and Northern Manhattan and the Bronx to experience this firsthand. And who better to have led that conversation than our special guest and moderator and my good friend, Minerva Tantoco, Chief Technology Officer for the City of New York. Thank you so much. Minerva and the panel, it is now yours.
Thank you, Commissioner Silver. It's really, really exciting to be here. Thank you all for joining this illustrious panel. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and kind of open the discussion on smart parks. And, I just wanted to say a few words. As the first CTO of New York, I'm super excited to be part of our smart city strategy. And for us, a smart city is also an equitable city. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed, according to William Gibson. And we want to distribute it more evenly. And parks make the perfect urban innovation lab, in my view. It's where people play. It's one of the most vital public spaces in any city. And it's a great opportunity to try out new things. So congratulations, Commissioner, on the SUFA pilot. We're very excited that we're kicking things off with that pilot. So without further ado, we'll introduce our panel and kick off the conversation.
Thank you, Minerva. It's really a pleasure to be here for this incredibly timely conversation, and having the good fortune of working with both Parks Department and the Mayor's Office of Tech and Innovation. It's also wonderful to see the leadership of these agencies and the mayoral office in bringing technology to the public realm. I'm Constantine E. I'm a professor of urban informatics at New York University. I think I'm one of the first faculty with that title formally, that urban informatics appendage. And I think it speaks to the novelty of this field of trying to use data and new computing technologies, new sensing technologies, a way to better understand cities and better to address urban problems. As importantly, I'm also a part of a team that is building the Center for Urban Science and Progress at New York University. This was one of the applied sciences campuses that came out of the previous administration. We're about 4 years in. We started with 2 of us. We have about 50 faculty and staff now, 100 graduate students being trained in urban informatics. So I think we'll be in good company in short period, including in those students about 17 city employees as well. So it's very exciting to see the mixing. My research focuses on a lot of different ways of bringing data and technology to bear on city problems. A major research initiative that I've been leading is something called the Quantified Community, which we're deploying at Hudson Yards, in Lower Manhattan, and in Red Hook to varying degrees. And essentially it's built on 2 premises. One is that the study of the city, especially in a place like New York, is actually a study of its neighborhoods. And we need to understand neighborhood dynamics to really be able to quantify, to measure, and to better explain this kind of urban drama that Lewis Mumford talked about, or the street ballet that Jane Jacobs talked about, and really to bring technology to bear to better answer those types of questions. The other piece of it is really thinking about how cities in general understand the physical layer of a city very well, infrastructure, buildings. They understand the regulatory layer of construction or planning very well. This informatics layer, as I like to call it, of how you bring dedicated technology, informatics, and computing capabilities into this way that people experience the city and connect the virtual and physical is incredibly important. So looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you very much. Welcome to the panel.
Thanks, Minerva, and thanks, of course, to you, Constantine, as well, for those interesting observations. I feel like I'm, in some ways, the counterpart here to CUSP in thinking about the analysis, the digital component of the city from the private sector point of view, but like you, with a deep background in the understanding of what makes cities work. So I have the privilege of being the Chief Policy Officer at Sidewalk Labs. Sidewalk Labs is a company formed just less than a year ago by Alphabet, which is Google's holding company. And our aspiration is to bring urban innovation enabled by digital technology to cities around the world. And to do so with a deep understanding of how cities actually work and how they are governed. Because our concern about what we've seen in so many smart cities and startup applications is while the technology is great, while the systems are very good, they actually don't necessarily work well with the human side of the city, with the institutional side of the city. And that's where Sidewalk Labs aspires to be smarter than the average bear. What we have started with is two things. First, we are, of course, the lead investor in Intersection, which is one of the companies that's partnered on CityBridge, which is the company producing the Link NYC system. And I think there's no better example of the integration of the public and the private, the consumer-facing, the corporate-facing, and the way hardware and software integrate in an urban environment to bring benefits to a broad range of people, and particularly, as Minerva has often pointed out in her tireless support of the Link rollout, to bridge the digital divide. And I have to say, it warmed my heart a couple of weeks ago walking down 3rd Avenue and watching a guy who based on his clothing, I think he must have been homeless, dancing, watching a music video on the screen on the Link NYC, and I felt like this moment of great success. I think we'd brought something to somebody at that moment. But it doesn't, of course, just stop with the Link system. Sidewalk Labs is now working on a product we call Flow, where we hope to take transportation data from a wide variety of sources, different phones that people are carrying around, different applications, other sources of data that city governments and other private entities are collecting, and understand the movements, the origins and destinations to rationalize transportation better. And then I think in the world of parks in the urban realm, Sidewalk Labs does not have a product, but I think the observation that is motivating some of my thinking on this is really the twin impulses that led us to, on one hand, when I helped lead Plan YC, the integration of streets and parks and public plazas, thinking about the whole urban realm as one system. Technology helps break down boundaries, and that's one thing we can do. And the other is thinking about drawing an additional aspect of urban system, of urban activity into parks and other public areas. We know that parks are great for recreation. We do a very good job of providing the public realm for consumption, for shopping and cafes and things. We don't do as good a job for doing our work outside. And I think that's a big opportunity for us with technology.
Great, thank you, Rit.
Hi, everybody. I'm Matthew Lister. I run the New York office of Gell Studio, which is a design consultancy that's actually based in Copenhagen and is based on the work of Jan Gell. So we've been, for between 4 and 5 decades now, really spending a lot of time thinking about and studying the behavior of human beings in public space. And trying to understand the relationship of human behavior and the quality of public space, and then how that affects people's quality of life. I feel a little funny being up here on this panel about digital and tech and all that, because most of our work at this point, most of what we study is carried out using clipboards and clickers. So we use like a lot of analog methods to actually really pay attention to the way that people are interacting and moving through the public realm. So I think in a way my role will be to always be pitching for the study of people through observation, that we're super interested in the way that these new technologies can actually help cities measure the way that people are using cities, but we think it's very important still to continue to be out in the public realm watching the way that people, watching how human beings behave, right? Because humans are idiosyncratic beings, we can't always predict their behavior, so we need to pay attention. So the bench is amazing, and it's going to be super interesting to see how that data actually influences the design or refinement of parks. But we also need to make sure that we see whether or not people are smiling when they're next to the bench. So if we see them walking past it, great. How many people are there, where they're hanging out, where they're being stationary, that's wonderful. Are they smiling? We won't know that unless we're actually looking. So, and I'm sure that you guys have some methods that can help figure that out.
We're going to make a Smilometer.
With Smilometer,
Yes,
yeah. All right, so I'm here to pitch for the Smilometer. But I would also say that one thing that is super exciting to me about the time that we live in now and with the work that you all are doing is that, you know, up until relatively recently, cities only measured cars, right, or automobiles. And now we're seeing a lot of cities measure many things. And we know that when you're planning, the things that you measure ultimately influence the outcomes of your planning. And so by measuring people and by measuring quality of life and by measuring human beings, we understand our environment so much better, and our planning outcomes will actually start to reflect what humans need more than the other things that we measured before. So I'm excited to be here and part of this conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I mean, so we've heard about how it's not just about the tech, it's about humanizing the tech, that neighborhoods are an important sort of atom of study. So New York City is a city of neighborhoods, and that we also shouldn't forget that we need to measure what we care about, like smiles. So thank you for that set of opening remarks. So the first question is about how has technology changed, you know, the potential for how we can study the uses of our open spaces, and what do you see as some of the specific things about technology that it can help us do?
Sure, I'll start with that. So it's been interesting, obviously, to hear, or not necessarily obviously, but kind of the rebirth and the reemergence of Holly White. I think in these conversations continually comes up. And, you know, it's interesting to think about from an observational point of view, the study of a public place using at the time 8mm cameras, which was the best technology for doing that available at that moment. Today, we have an incredible breadth and depth of ways of bringing sensing technologies to bear on this. And I think, you know, obviously the ubiquity of smartphones and Wi-Fi through Link and other things will now allow us to understand people flows throughout a city in a way we couldn't before. But a lot of the work that we've been thinking about at NYU is how do we also take some of these sensing technologies that have been reserved for the physical and natural sciences, you know, that have been reserved for the study of the universe and of planets and of stars. How do you take remote sensing, for instance, high-resolution imagery, thermal imaging, all of these other opportunities to actually really understand how the dynamics of a place. So I think it's just it's really an exciting time where you have a lot of folks who are interested on this common question of mobility and activity and what influences urban activity and street life with this you know, emergence and convergence of different technologies to actually let us ask and answer questions in a way we haven't before.
I mean, one of the things that I'm super excited about is, you know, typically when we measure something, that's usually a static snapshot in time, right? That you go out and we survey a park in one day, and then that's the information that we have. But with these ubiquitous sensors that are always on, collecting data all the time, I think that creates a much more dynamic environment for planning, where the feedback loop between let's learn something and then change something in order to improve something could be much faster. And also, I think because you're capturing all of that data, you can actually act as sort of like a time machine then, right? You can go back in time and say, there was an event at the park and we have all the data. We want to see how that event influenced or affected the behavior of people. That part's just fascinating to me. The fact that it's super dynamic, the feedback loop can be very, very fast now. So.
One thing I'd just add to that, and I think it's a huge opportunity, particularly for the Parks Department, and I want to congratulate you, Commissioner, on the bench, because I think it's exactly the right kind of thing to be doing. But unlike so many corporations and even, frankly, so many aspects of government broadly defined, there's something about the Parks Department that we all inherently trust. And it seems that there's an opportunity to develop an even greater relationship with the users of the parks, and so, of course, we usually gather completely anonymous data. And whenever you start talking about the kinds of systems that you just described, Constantine, the concerns around privacy and anonymity come up. If there is an agency that could get people voluntarily and with all the correct disclosures and all the correct protections to give up a little more information about themselves and how they're using New York City, I expect it's the Parks Department. And there may be an opportunity to do some really creative things there.
Yeah, those are great comments. And in fact, the data collected, if they do influence the experience design, may also be a tool for the residents as well to quantify things about their neighborhood. So picking up on that, what are some of the sort of trade-offs or challenges when you start to collect data with these methods, and what do you think we can glean from those challenges?
Well, I'll just say, I think that it starts with making sure that people are comfortable with the information that's being gathered, and that is, you have to do that in a couple of different ways. You have to make sure that people know. You have to make sure that the people who have access to the data are supervised, or at least there are governance procedures. But I think there is that commonality of why is data being collected, and if people buy into that, they become far more comfortable with whatever you're doing. And I think this idea, and Minerva and Matthew, you both kind of touched on it, the more interactive that becomes, we've all seen, okay, there's going to be a pilot, it'll be there for 30 days, and someone will figure out how it went and decide whether to continue it, right? You begin to offer the ability to be much more interactive with the users. That creates that individual relationship with whatever organization. It could be Gale Associates, it could be the Parks Department, whatever. And then you have an ongoing relationship with an individual.
Yep, and I think to kind of pick up on that, I think that trust relationship is built on the way that the data is used, and that people will feel. So we're going to collect this data in order to measure something and learn something. We're going to try something out that we think is going to improve your life, right? This data is going to help us understand whether or not it is improving your life, and then if it isn't, we're going to stop doing this and we're going to try something new, right? And so that feedback loop of we're trying something to improve, we need this data to do that, and having that go quickly. And then also the key thing too is that if we learn that it's not working, we will change it. I think that helps to build the trust and sort of the buy-in for people like, oh, this data that I'm giving up right now is something that is going to impact me. Which is also why I think the parks angle is super important, right? Because it's an easier thing to understand, I think, right? We can make our parks better.
I think I'd just pick up on that as well. I mean, I think that, obviously transparency is critical here in terms of what's being collected, how it's being used. But I think a big part of that is also engaging with people in communities and in and around parks, and people who are using parks, for instance, to understand what are the problems, what are the challenges that they face, and then figure out how the data can actually be an enabler and actually be in service to those problems. I think one of the big challenges has been, especially in this realm of big data and cities, as where the conversation started in the smart city realm, started with large companies who were thinking about these systematic problems, collecting data, and thinking that they could come up with these kind of unified solutions, rather than really trying to understand at the end of the day how the data was going to be used and what the problems of the people on the living in cities actually were. So I think this connection of using the technology and the data not only as a way of better understanding cities, but of course of connecting and informing planning and informing that understanding between the citizen and the city, for instance, is going to be vital to continuing that trust.
No, that's great. This reflects a lot of the conversations around you don't experience the city from the aerial view, you experience the city from the street view, and that how you measure things, whether you measure them by acreage or usage, makes a huge difference in terms of how the city is going to make decisions about where it's going to invest, in more smaller parks, one giant park, and that could be extended to other plans. I know some of you have talked about the privacy and transparency as being key components of this. What are some of the measures that you think we can do? Is it sort of posting signs that you are being measured here, or have you given some thought as far as what is the best way to gain that trust about measurement in these areas?
I mean, when we measure, we do it with humans out there with clipboards, right? So people are like, what are you doing? Well, this is what we're doing and why. But I'd be interested to hear your guys' input on this particular question.
So I think this is really again the question of engagement with residents and community is so critical. But also, one of the complicating factors is that privacy in the big data age is really a continuum. And it's really depending on kind of what people perceive as the value back to them and what is the value of the product or service or information they're getting back. And I think we look at this with Facebook, for instance, where people voluntarily give up incredibly amounts of sensitive information. But they're willing to do it because they want to build the social networks. It's an important piece of their life. One thing that we're exploring, so we've developed sensors that we're deploying as part of this quantified community project that measure things like air quality and noise levels. And one of the things we're starting to work with is something called the physical web, which actually allows the connectivity of a user and the device itself, so that as they're walking by the device, a URL will pop up on their phone and they can click on it and go to a website to understand what that device is collecting, what information, look at the data for the neighborhood, and really be able to engage much more directly with these things rather than having them be just black boxes that nobody really understands what's happening and what they're producing. So I think those type of technical ways of engagement can be pretty valuable.
I mean, I also wonder whether there isn't something, there are a few agencies, probably none in city government, that have been as effective at marshaling volunteers in the service of their work as the Parks Department. It's a measure, again, of the kind of warmth that I think most New Yorkers feel towards this agency. Certainly as somebody who's done some of that kind of thing myself, if the Parks Department were to ask me to download an app and said, here, we'd like to understand how you use the parks, which parks you go to, how long you spend there, etc. And here's the way we're going to use it and for nothing else, I'd totally be willing. It's a volunteer effort to offer data, right, in this world we live in where individual data is an asset that you have. I think the other thing... Kind of
like counting trees.
It's exactly, no, it's very similar.
Just
it's like, okay, if you don't have a Saturday afternoon to do some work in the park, I mean, here's another way you can contribute. That's a deal that I think lots and lots of New Yorkers would take. Of course, there are digital divide issues. There would be overrepresentation concerns. That would have to be carefully considered, and you could figure out probably how to factor that out of the data you got. But it would be one way to establish that kind of relationship.
And I think if there's a way then to help people understand how that data can actually empower them to be better constituents or better consumers of planning would be pretty great. Like, I think one of the challenges with data is that it's not, I think, people who are not in these conferences and don't think about this stuff all the time probably are unaware about why we're measuring the things that we're measuring. And that in a lot of cases, the things that we're measuring because we have the capability to measure it, and not the other way around. And so, I'd implore cities and policymakers to try and figure out what it is that they want to find out, and then find the best way to measure it. And the communications should maybe come around from that side of the question, right? We want to learn about the way the people are sitting, so we're going to measure that, right?
Yeah, that's excellent. So, great comments from all of you. The notion that the feedback loop and being able to participate, but also get the results back in some way, whether that's through understanding what your neighbors said about that park, or some method of responsiveness, whether it's feeding back and seeing a change in the park based on that, or opting in, as you said, and being a volunteer. So, I'm going to ask the last sort of big round of questions in terms of, what are the key considerations? And, again, we'll apply the Parks Department because, trying something out, a pilot, is sort of kind of risky. It's an experiment. You're trying to see, what the results are. You don't know, how well it's going to turn out. But that's sort of the way to get to innovation, is to try things out iteratively and work things through. So what are some of the key considerations from your point of view, and sort of continuing sort of the idea that you can start to really use technology and data collection as part of, the human experience design? I'll just go down.
Sure. So I think that you mentioned testing things out and pilot. And this is, cities have always been laboratories to some degree. It's just typically the process of instituting a policy or a change and then evaluating it, as Matthew pointed out, is a very long process, right? So now we have this opportunity to do these kind of tests at a scale and a speed that a city hasn't been able to do before. So the opportunity and the agility to be able to do that. Now, practical challenges and realities of being able to do this are things like infrastructure. Cities were not necessarily designed with the infrastructure to support this type of connectivity and technology. So even when we're thinking about putting sensors, I'm sure this has happened with benches and other, and the bench and other considerations of just of that type of Wi-Fi access, of power that you need to run these types of things. So even some basic infrastructure of thinking about how do you establish and how do you set up these communities to then be able to actually receive this type of testing and this type of deployment. And I think beyond that, there's also this critical need, of course, for some principles around how you use the data that's collected and how you guide those test deployments, right? How do you structure them? How do we make sure, and how does the city make sure that the data is being used responsibly, that these pilots are being coordinated and actually meeting a determined need as well? So I think there's this combination of kind of the physical infrastructure need and then more of a policy kind of understanding of how to actually approach these types of laboratories.
And that's great. The government has a role to play in helping to guide the usage and coordinating across multiple constituencies. They all are trying out different things, and that it helps to coordinate them with the direction of, this is for an equitable purpose, or this is for an efficiency of planning purpose. So what are some of the key considerations?
In fact, you've just hit on exactly what I was going to touch on, Minerva, which is that making clear what the overall objective is, right? Because I think, Matthew, you made the point about we're doing this to try to make your lives better. Well, of course, who gets to judge when my life is better? How do you define better? Is it more traffic going through the streets? Is it more people in the parks? Or if I think actually my park is overcrowded, maybe that's not a strategic objective I agree with, whatever. So articulating that, and then of course pilots are great to show people different ways that things can be and introduce strategic changes in small tastes. But I think it always works when you are most explicit about what you're trying to demonstrate.
Great, thank you, Rit. And parting words?
Everybody basically said, I guess the one thing I think that hasn't been mentioned, well, maybe a little bit, is that I think that the data is only as useful as the story that you can clearly communicate to people. And so I think that there is a tendency to kind of fetishize data in a way. And so I'll go back to this idea that we measure what we care about. And so it's important, I think, for everybody that's in this world to always be thinking, what is the communication strategy around this? What is the real purpose for why we're doing this? Are we, generating a ton of infographics that people don't understand? Like, how is this actually influencing change in a way that we think is important? And then you mentioned that pilots are risky, and I agree with that. But I also think there's another way to think about pilots, which is that it actually is a way to de-risk the larger, more scary, big investments, because you can learn in smaller increments. And I think that's super important for cities to continue to do, and that this dynamic data feedback loop will allow cities to do that faster and probably cheaper. So it really does de-risk those big projects. So.
Totally agree. That's exactly right. Straight from the CTO playbook is de-risking through prototyping and piloting. Instead of buying 1 million of these, buy 100 and then see how well it goes. So with that, we would definitely like to interact with you all in the audience and open it up for Q&A. So when you speak, please say who you are and your question. Okay, Ibrahim.
Okay, my name is Ibrahim. So just two things. I was just reflecting on at DEP we do the AMR, where the automated meter reading. How are networks like that and also the MetroCard network as sort of like the first way that we've sort of interacted with technology in New York City in like this like networked way? I'm just curious from the panel, like, have you guys thought about that as ways that, or have we learned anything from those processes? And then also, how could that be rolled out within this framework? And then connected to that, we have this whole framework of rules that we have in parks. You walk into a park, it says, don't do this, don't do that. And in the last session I was in, we were like, well, what if we got a sign that said, do this, right? And so then in this context, it was almost like, it would almost be a great way to present this would be like, 30% of people who come to this park do this. And that would give you some sort of ownership. So that was sort of like is that a direction that this could potentially go in? But I really am curious about your thoughts on AMR and MetroCard. Just curious about that.
Well, I could jump in at least on the first. Really thinking about a great example of an incredible amount of data that could be used for lots of different purposes, but was intended for one very specific use, both with AMR and MetroCard. With MetroCard, we would have loved, the transportation planners among us if, we also got exits as well as entrances. But, thinking about how you can use that data and how, I think this goes back to the larger issue of, how city agencies communicate with one another and how we break down these silos along this kind of information sharing and data sharing. Because, water usage data, for instance, can be used for a lot of different purposes beyond what DEP itself is trying to use it for. For instance, one of the big questions was that we had heard from some conversations with OEM was, how do we know when people evacuate in an evacuation order? Well, the AMR data could be used really well to do that. So there's this opportunity, I think, with these kind of massive data sets and system rollouts that allow us to ask and answer other questions about the city that maybe they weren't initially intended for.
Back behind you.
Hi, I'm Linda Jones from the Seward Park Conservancy, and I have a couple of things I'd like to say. First of all, my first feeling about a bench that was going to measure my appearance in a particular place was, God, I'm going to leave my phone home from now on. I don't want to be measured everywhere, and I bet you I'm not the only one who feels that way. And I am an IT professional, and I know that data can end up in the wrong place, in the wrong hands. I feel a little more reassured by hearing you folks talk about policies and principles and explaining things to people. But you got a long way to go to convince me. Secondly, I represent a park which is in a low-income area. I would bet that only a minority of people in that park have a cell phone or a smartphone. They speak various languages, so if you're going to put up a sign and saying you are being monitored in this park, please be sure to put it in Chinese and Spanish as well as English. Thank you.
Okay, he's back there with I'm trying to evenly distribute the questions.
Is there a role to be played in terms of natural systems and their impacts upon or interaction with this, data collection? Can you respond to that? You know what I mean by natural systems? No, the site ecology, runoff, temperature changes, things of that sort. Are these factors that play into data collection and analysis?
Well, I mean, when we look at a site, we do a public space, public life survey. And so we actually combine a study of the public life condition where we're seeing how many people are going, how many people are hanging out, what they're doing when they're hanging out. We combine that with an analysis of the public space qualities, right? So what are the physical characteristics of the space that those people are in, and that includes some study of the natural environment and the microclimate conditions that are created by that environment, because it helps us understand why a space may or may not invite more or less people in it, right? Because if it's incredibly sunny out and there's no shade, for example, nobody wants to be there. Or if it's a large space that's totally windswept and there's no way to block that wind, nobody wants to be there. So we do combine a spatial analysis with the life study.
But I think if I understood your question right, it was less about how are people using the space and more about the natural systems and the roles and values that they create for the city as a whole. And one thing I will observe, and of course, when I was working at Plan YC, we did a lot to try to bring natural systems into city policy. One of the interesting things is that because of the 100-year bias towards heavily engineered solutions for problems such as stormwater runoff or things like that, there's an assumption that if you design, for example, a concrete sewer, right, that it will always perform according to its design specifications, right? There is a bias against saying, well, okay, we think that this green swale will have this impact in terms of stormwater runoff, right? So the burden of proof is much more on the natural system to demonstrate its performance under the regulatory regime in which many of our decisions are made. So for example, if you go to the EPA, and Ibrahim at DEP knows this all too well, you go to the EPA and you have to comply with your Clean Water Act requirements, right? You have, in fact, an easier time doing so without providing outcome data if your solution is primarily using concrete than if it's using natural systems. And so I think one of the big opportunities here is to correct that bias by using data to actually meter how these systems are performing. That would be the thing that I would most run to.
I think as an extension of that, I mean, we talked a lot about kind of measuring people, which has its incredible opportunities and pitfalls, but also there's, it's one thing that's striking with like parks and public spaces that we still in many cases need to justify this investment of why green space, right? But the opportunity really allows us now with the ways to collect data to be able to measure the impacts, positive and negative potentially, of various designs of public space and kind of urban ecology. So thinking about if we're measuring localized temperature, for instance, we could really understand the urban heat island effect and how green spaces affect that at a larger scale. If we're measuring air quality at a very localized level, we could understand how trees affect air quality down to an incredibly granular scale that we're not able to do right now. So I think it's this combination of measuring activity and what ultimately motivates activity or influences activity, as well as just understanding how the environmental and built environments really, or the natural and built environments really interact. That's really critical here.
And I will just point out there's a great tradition embodied in the weather station in Central Park at the castle. Shows how collecting data on natural resource or natural systems in parks has a century-long tradition.
What I like about what you said too is that I think, we had a long history or period for a while of coming up with engineering solutions that satisfied only one problem, right? And so what's interesting about this idea that you could measure natural resource impacts, people impacts, economic impacts all together, that when you're doing that and you're optimizing for all those things at once, your design solutions change, right? You need to figure out a way to do something that is a win-win-win solution instead of just a single one-liner solution, right? And I think the world needs that, actually.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And jumping in there too, which is the notion that you might have that one purpose, but it's that notion of discovery. So that when you do see all the data together, that you might actually uncover or discover new things. And I'll make a pitch for one of the key principles. I think it's around interoperability amongst these different data sets, so that you do have the opportunity to combine them and have the ability to look at data across different collection points, across different sensors, so you can make those discoveries. I saw a question, red tie in the middle there. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think a lot of us, when we start thinking about sensors and connectivity of this type, we think about passive data collection on occupancy and noise levels and air quality. I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about opportunities for active feedback at the technological level. So you mentioned the physical web, pushing to somebody's smartphone, hey, this is what's going on here. Is there a next step where it says, respond with yes if you like what's going on here, or similar types of feedback gathering?
Yeah, so obviously, or again, maybe not obviously, but I think participatory sensing in this kind of citizen science model is incredibly valuable. I mean, we're starting to see this just through open data and people, hackers out there, just starting to uncover things that that the government working by itself may not have had the capacity or the time to really try and understand. And I think that there's really no better supplement or kind of way or complement to kind of this passive data collection is kind of really getting people engaged. Because that's, I think, the most direct route of saying, well, measure what's important to you, and rather than a bunch of scientists trying to figure out what sensors to put out, people enabled with cell phones and other very low-cost sensors can collect incredible amounts of information. And to your point, one of the things that we actually are doing in that physical web pilot is actually engaging with folks so that we can ask them how they're, how they're experiencing the environment. So we could look at this subjective versus objective measurement of space and of the environment. Because we think across neighborhoods and across socioeconomic backgrounds and across cultures, people will experience noise differently. They'll experience heat differently. So there's not going to be one solution just because we see an area that has consistently high temperatures that we might adopt wholesale. So we really have to think about kind of how the differences of neighborhoods and communities and individual spaces really will impact how we think about very tailored responses to the problems that we ultimately might uncover.
And I will just add, I think there's a huge opportunity, as I said earlier, to build a relationship. That two-way feedback. You see this in the private sector, whether it's, you stay at a hotel and you're a member of their frequent flyer system, and after you leave the hotel, you get the email saying, hey, can you tell us what you liked, et cetera, right? No matter how small the percentage of responses is, there is this additional connection that those companies have realized people value. We don't think generally in city government about our citizens in exactly that way and creating that personal relationship, but it's an opportunity, right? And if people are asked, oh, hey, because you had signed up to allow us to identify you when you come to the park because you're a longstanding parks volunteer, we know you just left the such and such playground, how was it, right? Or was anything broken? Right? I mean, the kind of feeling and relationship that you could build, the trust that you could build, I think is pretty significant, leaving aside the value of the data that you would get.
I think we have time for just one or two short questions.
Hi, thanks for the input. I'm a professor of architecture at Yale University, and I'm interested in this comment that was made about data simulation and the discontents around it that was brought up. And the world we live in today with big data, we no longer have data compression going on. We can actually, in real time, experience an immersive environment of this data field that you're pulling in. What I'm not hearing getting talked about is what and where these kinds of new physical virtual spaces or experiences can be found or had. How do we gain access? This kind of idea of social transparency that we want to keep open to the park. So I'm looking to the professor there on the left-hand side who does data information and analysis. What ways in which can, as the public or general public, can we interact, or what tools are we bringing to bear in the environment that deal with the social dimensions of this. Remember, there's this spooky kind of entanglement that goes on. Once you get the data back, doesn't mean that the experiment or the test hasn't been affected by the very fact that you're taking measure of that experiment. And I think when I take these tests over my phone or so forth, I think about this a lot, this data coming back. Could you guys kind of address like where the touch tones are, where are the real points where the public individuals can interact with this kind of new virtual, kind of immersive environment?
Yeah, I mean, those are all good points, and I don't have answers to most of them. I think observational bias is very real. Sample bias is very real, even with big data, obviously. And, you have the very simple issue of kind of not everyone has a Wi-Fi enabled cell phone, so you're not counting or accounting for everyone in a playground or park at a given time. So it's those kind of limitations that I think it's very important for us as researchers to understand. I mean, I think that's been the interesting exercise over the past few years, where we've brought together physicists and computer scientists and planners and economists, and all of those fields have very different traditions. And some of the more technical fields that are more comfortable with the data are not comfortable with the social problems, and then the social science fields are not necessarily as comfortable with the data. So we've had a very interesting kind of few years trying to bring those worlds together. And what we found is that it's really about, if you have some interesting data and a really interesting problem, you're able to get a lot of people from different backgrounds working together on it. And I think that's where the opportunity is going forward. And just from a purely academic point of view, the really interesting, I think, the revolution here with big data is really going to be around the social sciences and how we think about the study of human behavior and of collective behavior and of the dynamics of cities. And so that's perhaps an aside conversation, but anyway, that's part of the answer to your question, hopefully. Sure, so, yeah. Go ahead.
So to the gentleman on the right, or my right.
Me?
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah. So what's interesting about your research is it appears to be a kind of on-the-ground kind of tracking and mapping of social interaction, not necessarily about data collection, about points of data, right? It's the interaction between the social and potentially the physical or the spatial. Right,
yeah, I don't know if I would say social interaction. I mean, basically what the Public Life Survey does is it measures movement, it measures age and gender in a very sort of, not a very granular way, but it's sort of a sense for it. And then it also measures stationary activities, which is essentially, because cities that are vibrant are cities that invite more people in to stay longer is the baseline there. And so we just want to understand how public spaces are performing with regard to stationary activities. What are people doing when they decide to stick around? And if they're not sticking around, why aren't they? What are the physical things that may or may not invite them to stick around more? So it's literally just mapping. Yeah.
We are just about out of time, so I want to thank the panelists. It's been a really great conversation. Academia, technology, design, and government having a conversation together. Thank you all, and please give a hand to our panelists. Thank you so much for such great insights. Thank you.